Hi guys, Happy New Year's. I don't know about y'all, but 2024 for me was pretty hectic, so I'm ready to start anew. Before I do though, I wanted to talk about some of my top reads of 2024, and these are Fraternity by Andy Mientus, Into the Riverland by Nevo, Gwen and Art Are Not in Love by Lex Crucier, Weyward by Emilia Hart, Don't Let the Forest End by C.G. Drews, Pet by Akwaeke Emezi, and Lone Woman by Victor Laville. In some of these books, I read them earlier in the year, so I might not talk about them as much just because I don't remember them as well, so sorry about that. When reviewing books, especially in video format, I realize I have a hard time articulating my feelings about the books. Looking over my format for YouTube videos like this, I just didn't really like it, and it would be frustrating because it's not like I don't have anything to say about these books. I just have so much to say that I'd get overwhelmed. It was like trying to empty a lake with a Dixie cup. And I also usually try to make my review spoiler free, so I am vague in my explanations, and I think that's actually hindering me in the long run. I'm still doing trial and error with this YouTube thing, so this time around I decided to look up some book club questions as a guideline. What I mean by this is I literally googled questions for book clubs, and I found a couple websites that gave me an exhaustive list of these questions. I then picked the ones I liked and created my own list. And for each book I reviewed in this video, I cherry-picked the questions that I picked that I wanted to answer for the specific book. So I'm not going to always use the same questions for each book. I mostly chose based on what I think would spark an interesting discussion. The one question I do answer for all of them though is, quote, what kind of reader would most enjoy this book, end quote. And the two websites I used to get my questions were bookclubs.com and Penguin Books. I don't know if this is something I'll always do, but answering the book club questions helped organize my thoughts, and it also gave me ideas of things to talk about that I didn't think of before. And if you hear me keep saying book club questions and you don't exactly know what I mean by that, you'll see when I start reviewing. It will start to make sense. And like I mentioned before, I am going to have spoilers in these reviews now, but I tried my best for like the first half of the reviews for each of the books to be decently spoiler free, and just the end half is gonna have spoilers, so I'll have warnings of when I'm going to start talking about spoilers, and I'll also have a timestamp of where I stop talking about those spoilers, and that typically is just gonna be when I go to the next book. So yeah. One more thing, for some of the books I review, I'm going to mention my Booktober challenge, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, I basically on my Instagram did a Booktober month challenge where I had different prompts for books that I was going to try and read. And I actually didn't get to finish that because in the midst of me doing that, I had a family death, but some of the books that I'm going to be talking about, I used for the Booktober challenge, so when you hear me talk about that, that's what I mean. So yeah, let's get going. First up is Fraternity. The synopsis of the book. In the fall of 1991, Zoe Orson transfers to the Blackfriars School for Boys, hoping for a fresh start following a scandal at his last school. However, he quickly learns that he isn't the only student keeping a secret. Before he knows it, he's fallen in with a group of boys who all share the same secret, one which they can only express openly within the safety of the clandestine gatherings of the Vicious Circle, the covert club for gay students going back decades. But when the boys unwittingly happen upon the headmaster's copy of an arcane occult text, they unleash an eldritch secret so terrible it threatens to consume them all. So there are 4 main characters in this book, and they are Leo. He's the more stereotypical feminine gay man, but there's way more to him than just that. He's sort of the mom of the group and also runs a lot of things in the Vicious Circle. He also is the only person in the friend group that isn't rich. He got into Blackfriars off of a scholarship. Daniel is one of the only black people who go to the school. He also lives this double life of being one of the star players on the school's rugby team and hanging out with a lot of the popular guys in school, but he also has a boyfriend and goes to vicious circle meetings. Steven, who is a quiet bookworm, who just in general is extremely smart. Although he isn't very talkative, he's always present in the friend group and in the vicious circle and will help out the people that are important to him. And then Zoe, who is like the protagonist of the book. As it says in the synopsis, he joins Blackfriars in the middle of the year because of a scandal that happened in his last school that related to him. And he knows that he's queer, but struggles to see it as anything other than like a curse or a problem. So yeah, the 4 main characters of this book, again, are Leo, Daniel, Steven, and Zoe. I don't list out the protagonists of all of my books that I'm going to review here. The way I decided what books I was going to do that with, basically if I was going to bring up the names of the characters a lot, I then made the list for them. But yeah, so not all of them are going to have a list. First question. Would you recommend this book to someone? Why or why not? Or with what caveats? Yes, I definitely would. I think it was written beautifully, and it discusses the AIDS epidemic, a part of history that a lot of people don't like to talk about. Nowadays, there's definitely more light being shed on that subject, but not to the degree that should be discussed. My only caveat would be check the trigger warnings. What kind of reader would enjoy this book the most? If you love Dead Poets Society, but wish it took the extra step to make it actually gay, I would recommend this book. It's very similar to it. If you like stories about evil old secret societies, especially those ones that use malevolent magic for their own means, this is a book for you. And if you like found family, which I feel like most of the population does. Did you like or dislike the characters and why? Did it influence how much you enjoyed the book? I love the characters, and it definitely enhanced my reading experience because I cared about what happened to them. Which characters did you relate to the most? I don't think there was a specific character that I can pick out, but there were aspects of each of the main characters that I related to. Overall, I related to being ostracized in high school, and honestly, all of public school, though they didn't go to a public school, but that's neither here nor there. And also just being afraid to be completely open about my sexuality, and also just being afraid that I was going to be outed in some way. I related to Leo first being like the quote-unquote old gay that new gays go to when they have questions or need support. If you don't know what I mean, it's a common thing that happens where people who just recently realize they're queer in some capacity have the problem with coming to terms with their identity and or also trying to understand it, which is a hard thing to do, especially at the same time. And what's helpful for them is to confide in people who have been in the queer community for quite some time because they understand what this newly queer person is going through, which, you know, understandable. Makes sense. It's something Leo does in the novel, specifically with Zoe, but seeing the way he interacts with the vicious circle, it's clear he is that sort of person for a lot of people. I also have been that quote-unquote old gay for a lot of people in the past, and even now, so. The way Leo analyzes how people are feeling and acting at pretty much all times is something that also resonates with me. With Zoe, I understand having your family members have complicated feelings with your sexuality, where they don't blatantly disown you and slander you for it, but they also don't necessarily accept it. Daniel, I understand the religious trauma that comes from being queer, especially when your family is pretty devout, although his situation is different than mine because I personally was raised Roman Catholic, where most of the people were Italians in my church, whereas he grew up in the Black church, which is its own nuanced thing. But the general trauma one gets from being in a religious family, but also being queer, is something that I can understand. Steven doesn't get as much of a deep dive into his character as the others do, and I really wish he did. In the novel, he talks about feeling not like a priority friend to Leo, Daniel, and Zoe, and I have felt that way as well in some of the friend groups I've had in the past. Though for his case, I don't think he actually was seen as a lesser friend to the others. It was more he didn't realize how important he was to them. Looking back on my explanation, I guess the character I related to the most was Leo, seeing how much I just talked about him, so yeah. Did you trust the characters? I didn't trust Zoe at times because in certain circumstances, he was not the brightest in the bunch. Warning, spoilers ahead. Proceed with caution. If there was one thing about the book you could have improved, what would it be? I really wish I got more from Stephen. I think it would have been really cool to read a point of view from him, especially since he's very hard to discern. I'm also pissed that he died. I wanted to see him develop as a character. I do think it would have been cool if after Leo and Daniel got expelled, it was only Stephen and Zoe left at school. I should add that in the novel, the existence of the vicious circle got leaked, and they started to expel a lot of the students who were in it, Daniel and Leo being among them. I believe Stephen also got expelled, but I can't remember that well, because, like, right after all that happens, he dies. But I think it would have been cool if he didn't die or get expelled, and he was at the school while Zoe started to try to completely shove down his identity, which he does because of the expellings and also the magic that him and the other three unleashed. But I think that would have been an interesting dynamic to see, especially with Zoe trying to pass a straight. If you couldn't tell by the amount of yapping I've done, I love this book. It was funny because I just randomly decided to listen to it as an audiobook one day. I had no idea that it was going to be one of my favorite books of all time when I did that. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars on Storygraph. I try not to give books 5 out of 5s too often because I want to show that when I do give it that rating, it means that the book was extremely good to me. A deciding factor in if I'll make a book a 5 out of 5 is if it emotionally moves me to an extreme extent, so this book successfully did that. Next is Into the Riverlands, the synopsis. Wandering cleric Chi of the Singing Hills travels to the Riverlands to record the tales of the notorious near-immortal martial artists who haunt the region. On their road to Bethany Docks, they fall in with a pair of young women far from home and an older couple who are more than they seem. As Chi runs headlong into an ancient feud, they find themselves far more entangled in the history of the Riverlands than they ever expected to be. Accompanied by Almost Brilliant, a talking bird with an indelible memory, Chi confronts old legends and new dangers alike, as they learn that every story, beautiful, ugly, kind, or cruel, bears more than one face. Would you recommend this book to someone? Why or why not? Or with what caveats? Yes, the whole concept and plot was just awesome. One caveat I'd give is the narrating style is a little unique and isn't for everyone, but I personally really enjoy it. One thing that makes it unique from other historical fantasy novels is a lot of books in this genre usually have main characters that are royalty, aristocracy, or work for the upper class in some capacity, whereas this book specifically shows how just normal everyday people live their lives. What kind of reader would most enjoy this book? If you like historical fantasy, if you'd like a change of pace when it comes to fantasy novels, because this one is unique in a lot of ways, and if you want a quick, fast read. How did the author create the fantasy world in the book? Did they provide any maps, glossaries, appendixes to help you understand it? She mostly showed the world through the character simply interacting with it. Has it made you want to read anything else by the author? The author Nevo is probably one of my favorite authors of all times. This specific book didn't make me want to read more from her because I already read other books by her. Her novel, The Chosen and the Beautiful, is what made me seek out more of her works, and that's how I found Empress of Salt and Fortune, which is the first book in the series that Into the Riverlands is in. Did the design of the book cover mean more to you after you had finished reading it? Yes, the pictures on the book cover are related to what happens in the novel, though when you first look at the book cover, it's not immediately apparent. I'm going to be honest, I read this book in January of 2024, so I don't really remember exactly how the cover relates to it, but I do know it does. Source? Trust me, bro. For this book, I give it 5 out of 5 stars. It was one of the first books I read in 2024, and it was a good one to start off my year. Up next, Gwen and Art are not in love. Synopsis. It's been hundreds of years since King Arthur's reign. His descendant, Arthur, a future lord and general gadabout, has been betrothed to Gwendoline, the quick-witted, short-tempered princess of England since birth. The only thing they can agree on is that they despise each other. They're forced to spend the summer together at Camelot in the run-up to their nuptials, and within 24 hours, Gwen has discovered Arthur kissing a boy, and Arthur has gone digging for Gwen's childhood diary and found confessions about her crush on the kingdom's only lady knight, Bridget Leclerc. Realizing they might make better allies than enemies, they make a reluctant pact to cover for each other. And as things heat up at the annual royal tournament, Gwen is swept off her feet by her knight, and Arthur takes an interest in Gwen's royal brother. What kind of reader would most enjoy this book? If you're someone who needs a solid plot to go along with your romances, which is the kind of person I am, and probably why I like this book. If you like anything Arthur and the Round Table inspired, I only have watched a couple episodes of it, and only seen like a few posts about it, but I do think people who watched Merlin, the TV show, might like this as well. If you're a Merlin fan and you read this book, comment if you did like it. And also, if you're someone who likes high fantasy and who wants a more lighthearted read, would also like this book. Did you like or dislike the characters and why? Did it influence how much you enjoyed the book? I think the characters are what made the book so enjoyable. Has it made you want to read anything else by the author? Yeah, I recently bought another book by them called Not for the Faint of Heart, and I plan on reading it soon, actually. How did the author create the fantasy world in the book? Did they provide any maps, glossaries, etc. to help you understand it? They didn't have any maps or anything like that in this book. It was mostly explained through the characters themselves explaining it, or just how they navigated the world in general. How did the author present the magic system in the book? Did they do a good job of explaining how it works and what its rules and limitations are? Did it make sense and fit with the story? I like how the magic system is similar to how religion is in real life. There isn't any clear-cut evidence that any religion is real or fake. Believing in them is mostly based on faith, and that's how magic is in this book. It's not explained in great detail. I do feel like this may become a series of books, and if it is, I'm hoping it'll be explained better. If this is meant to be a standalone novel, then I do think the magic system should have been fleshed out way more. Again, the way it ended, it sort of seemed like it was implying there'd be a sequel or it would become a series, but I could be completely wrong. But yeah, this book gave me a lot more than I expected it to, and I can't wait to see what else this author does. I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars. We're now up to Weyward. Synopsis of the book. 2019. Under cover of darkness, Kate flees London for the ramshackle Weyward cottage, inherited from a great aunt she barely remembers. With its tumbling ivy and overgrown garden, the cottage is worlds away from the abusive partner who tormented Kate. She begins to suspect that her great aunt had a secret, one that lurks in the bones of the cottage, hidden ever since the witch hunts of the 17th century. 1619. Altha is awaiting trial for the murder of a local farmer who was stampeded to death by his herd. As a girl, Altha's mother taught her their magic, a kind not rooted in spellcasting but in a deep knowledge of the natural world. But unusual women have always been deemed dangerous, and as the evidence for witchcraft is set out against Altha, she knows it will take all her powers to maintain her freedom. 1942. As World War II rages, Violet is trapped in her family's grand, crumbling estate. Straitjacketed by societal convention, she longs for the robust education her brother receives, and for her mother, long deceased. who was rumored to have gone mad before her death. The only traces Violet has of her are a locket bearing the initial W and the word Weyward scratched into the baseboard of her bedroom, weaving together the stories of 3 extraordinary women across 5 centuries. Emilia Hart's Weyward is an enthralling novel of female resilience and the transformative power of the natural world. Something I've noticed while editing is I am not sure if her name is Alva or Altha. I listened to this as an audiobook, so I don't own a physical copy of this book, but I swear that I checked somewhere that her name was Alva, not Altha, but on the synopsis on Storygraph it says Altha, so I may this whole time have been pronouncing her name wrong, but I don't know, I guess I was wrong, but I really did think it was Alva. Like, I thought that I checked that, but I guess I didn't, so sorry about that. So the 3 main characters in this novel are Kate. Her story takes place in modern time, and she escapes from her abusive partner because she realizes that she's pregnant and she doesn't want her baby to suffer the same way she has. She also is completely disconnected to the magic that she has inherited. This magic is intertwined with nature, and as a kid she loved the natural world because of this. Warning, spoilers coming up. But one day while she was walking with her dad in a decently wooded area, I'm pretty sure her dad was taking her either to school or to the bus stop to go to school, but I could be wrong, I can't perfectly remember. She gets distracted by a bird nearby and starts to walk out on the road that they were near. When this happens, a car comes barreling towards her, so her dad pushed her out of the way and the car hits and kills him. So she blames herself for the death of her father and completely shoves away her intrigue of nature because of this, and in doing so she unwittingly shoves away her powers as well. The next character is Violet. As the synopsis mentions, her dad completely isolates her from the outside world, but this doesn't stop her from slowly learning the truth about her mother and why she died. In addition, her father invites a distant cousin to the estate in the hopes that him and Violet will be betrothed. Unfortunately, during this visit, her cousin assaults her and now she's stuck dealing with this trauma completely alone. And then lastly, Altha, a cunning woman who helps to heal the sick in her village when the treatments from doctors don't work. She gets accused of witchcraft when the husband of her childhood best friend dies suddenly, and the village that she once took care of turns against her. What kind of reader would most enjoy this book? If you like books about witches, if you like feminine rage and female solidarity, and books that discuss generational trauma, and also books with multiple point of views, you would probably like this book. I had just cautioned to people before reading this to check trigger warnings. If there was one thing about the book you could have improved, what would it be? I briefly talked about this in my Booktober post about this book, but Kate's plotline just wasn't as developed as well as Alva's and Violet's. I just feel like we didn't see her develop as a character all that much. It was more told to us rather than shown, which I feel like is a huge contrast compared to Alva and Violet. Especially her coming to terms with the power she inherited. She had so much revulsion from nature, which was also an extension to being repulsed by her powers. Something like that deserved a lot more developing, but it kind of got resolved really quickly in my opinion. I also feel like there should be a lot of development to a character who is going through domestic abuse and trying to break ties with their abusive partner, and there was definitely development, but I feel like there could have probably been more. So yeah. What were the main themes or messages of the book? A big theme in this book is the strength and resilience of women in a patriarchal society, and I thought it was a very beautiful theme to put in a book. If your book contained more than one timeline, how did they enhance your understanding of the story and characters? Did you find one timeline more interesting than the other? How did they interplay between the timelines and contribute to the overall impact of the book? The 3 timelines in the story added context to the magic in the story. It also is what made each woman's point of view so meaningful. I think Violet's point of view made the entire novel. Her development as a character was done amazingly, and her story in general is just very impactful. Her sexual assault was handled very well and can resonate with sexual assault survivors. I gave this one 3.5 stars out of 5. I gave it 3.5 just because of my issues with Kate's point of view. This is a book I think everyone should read. It is very refreshing to see a book that handled sexual assault and domestic abuse respectfully, because there are a lot of books out there right now that don't do that. And now, Pet. Synopsis: there are no monsters anymore, or so the children of Lucille are taught. Jam and her best friend, Redemption, have grown up with the lesson that the city is safe for everyone. But when Jam meets Pet, a creature who some might call monstrous, but in reality is anything but, she must reconsider what she's been told. Pet has emerged from one of her mother's paintings to hunt a true monster, and the shadow of something grim lurks in Redemption's house. Jam must fight not only to protect her best friend, but also uncover the truth and the answer to the question: how do you save the world from monsters if no one admits they exist? What kind of reader would most enjoy this book? People who like to read about generational trauma. If you want to read a book with a trans character. If you want a book that is very meaningful and impactful. If you want to read a book with a nonverbal character. I'm not sure if she would be considered 100% nonverbal, because at times she can speak, but a lot of times she uses sign language. But I'm not sure what the correct term would be for that. It could just be that she's considered nonverbal, but I'm not sure, so I don't want to say something wrong, you know? But if you do want to see characters like that, you would like this book. If there is one thing about the book you could have improved, what would it be? I think it could have actually been longer. Some of the character arcs felt a little rushed, and would have been better if the book was just a little bit longer. Again, this is another book I would check trigger warnings for. Also, I'm sorry I don't have much to say about Pet. Just like with Into the Riverlands, I read it, I think in January or just beginning of 2024, so I don't remember it as well. But I will say that I do honestly think people should read this book. It is very good, and it's very beautiful. I've been wanting to read this book for a long time, and I'm glad I finally did. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Up next, Don't Let the Forest In. The synopsis. High school senior Andrew Perreault find refuge in the twisted fairy tales that he writes for the only person who can ground him to reality, Thomas Rye, the boy with perpetually ink-stained hands and hair like autumn leaves, with his twin sister Dove inexplicably keeping him at a cool distance. Upon their return to Weyward Academy, Andrew finds himself leaning on his friend even more. But something strange is going on with Thomas. His abusive parents have mysteriously vanished, and he arrives at school with blood on his sleeves. Thomas won't say a word about it, and shuts down whenever Andrew tries to ask him questions. Stranger still, Thomas is haunted by something, and he seems to have lost interest in his artwork, whimsically macabre sketches of the monsters from Andrew's wicked stories. Desperate to figure out what's wrong with his friend, Andrew follows Thomas into the off-limits forest one night, and catches him fighting a nightmarish monster. Thomas's drawings have come to life and are killing anyone close to him. To make sure no one else dies, the boys battle the monsters every night. But as their obsession with each other grows stronger, so do the monsters, and Andrew begins to fear that the only way to stop the creature might be to destroy their creator. What kind of reader would most enjoy this book? If you want to read a book with an ace character in it, Andrew is alloromantic asexual. Anyone who likes horror, especially botanical and body horror, would like this book. This is another book that if you like Dead Poets Society, I think you may like this book too. I'm not sure if you would consider Don't Let the Forest In as dark academia like Dead Poets is, because Dead Poets Society has themes of kids who are academic overachievers, gain self-actualization, that show the systemic problems of schools, which is what a lot of dark academia lit does, and Dead Poets Society is like a house name for dark academia. With Don't Let the Forest In, Thomas and Andrew aren't exactly good at school and don't find that much value in it. I do think this book does critique schooling like Dead Poets does, but just in a different way. The whole tangent I just went on was all to say I think the vibes are similar to Dead Poets, and fans of that movie would probably also like this book, as long as you like horror. My only thing about this book is if body horror isn't your thing, I definitely wouldn't read this. Also check trigger warnings before reading. Lastly, if you were a victim to the series All for the Game, you would probably like this book. It has similar vibes to it, but it's written 10 times better than that series, and it's not problematic like that one is. Don't Let the Forest In also has supernatural elements to it, whereas All for the Game is meant to be realistic fiction, but I do think it scratches the itch that All for the Game does, and that will probably only make sense to people who have read that series, because it does, for whatever reason, to scratch a certain part of the brain, and like, I cannot explain it, but it just does, and you just have to have been a victim of the series to understand that. I'm going to go out and say that I don't endorse All for the Game or really recommend it to anyone, because the author and the series itself is problematic in a lot of ways. I'm just one of the many people who tried the first book and then just got sucked into it. Was the writing not the greatest? Yes, but I was still addicted to it.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
I've noticed everyone I've ever met who has read this series feels the same way I do, but I'm getting too off topic now. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, just Google it. All for the Game is just a book series. In conclusion, if you read it, you may like Don't Let the Forest In. Did you like or dislike the characters, and why? Did it influence how much you enjoyed the book? I loved all of them. They were just so endearing to me. Not just Thomas and Andrew, but side characters like Lana and Chloe as well. Thomas and Andrew are just like a prime example of teens with unaddressed mental health issues. Like, they see things very melodramatically, which in a certain way even non-mentally ill teens do this, but there is a specific way that they are melodramatic that's reminiscent of mentally ill teens. And I can say this confidently because when I was a teen, I had a shit ton of unaddressed mental health problems, and I did have similar thoughts that these two had. Probably not to the same degree, because I wasn't fighting horrors beyond my comprehension in the woods behind my school, but tomato tomato, you know. And I have more to say about this, but I'm not going to elaborate on it for now, because I'm planning on talking about this book in a separate video, and I don't want to repeat myself. Did you trust the characters? Not at all. For one, Andrew was an unreliable narrator. He was also so oblivious about Thomas's feelings for him, but it was low-key funny. The two also just wore this lens, like I said, of melodrama that skewed what was actually happening around them. Though, I guess I do trust Chloe and Lana, just not Andrew and Thomas. Which character's actions or decisions had the biggest impact on the plot, and how did it change the story? I think Andrew's reluctance to accept reality drastically affected his choices, and also how the plot played out. I also think Lana's willingness to help out Andrew also helped him develop further as a character, so I also think she played an important role to the plot as well. To conclude, two of my favorite types of horror is botanical horror or spore or anything like that, and body horror. This book combines both of those, so it was a perfect match for me. I also thought the author's prose in this novel was wonderful, and they are very skilled at writing when it comes to that. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars on Storygraph. Lone Woman. This is another book that I'm going to talk about in a separate video, so I'm not going to discuss all my thoughts on it. Synopsis. Adelaide Henry carries an enormous steamer trunk with her wherever she goes. It's locked at all times, because when the trunk opens, people around Adelaide start to disappear. The year is 1915, and Adelaide is in trouble. Her secret sin killed her parents, forcing her to flee California in a hellfire rush and make her way to Montana as a homesteader. Dragging the trunk with her at every stop, she will become one of the quote-unquote lone women, taking advantage of the government's offer of free land for those who can tame it. Except that Adelaide isn't alone, and the secret she's tried so desperately to lock away might be the only thing that will help her survive the harsh territory. What kind of reader would most enjoy this book? People who like books about the American frontier, especially frontier horror. I don't know if that's exactly a genre, but, you know. If you're sick of most books that talk about the frontier only being about tough, rugged white men, books with female solidarity, books with trans rep, and if you like the book Dread Nation by Justina Ireland, you would probably like this book. What were the main themes or messages of the book? I talked about this in my Booktober post for this book, but I want to go into more detail here. The American frontier has always been depicted as this rough, no man's land where it's every man for himself, and these frontiersmen took no handouts and were fighting on their own, which isn't exactly true. First of all, Western expansion wouldn't have been as successful as it was if the government wasn't handing out this land for free. There were aspects of these people on the frontier fending for themselves, obviously, but they did help each other out. They would help someone out and hoping that the other person would give them aid if they ever needed it. It just wasn't completely people isolated from each other. And there weren't only strong white men who settled in the frontier. It was more common for white men to do it, but they weren't the only ones going out there. I mean, the transatlantic railroad was built almost completely by Chinese immigrants. So white people, especially white men, weren't the only ones that had a hand in the westward expansion. I'm glad that the author of this book shed some light on others that went out into the frontier, and it made me enjoy the book even more. Has it made you want to read anything else by the author? He is one of the only men that I trust to write a good female character. I bought another one of his books, The Changeling, because I did really like this one so much, so I do want to see more of what he writes. Warning! Spoilers coming up. Did the author surprise or shock you with twists and turns in the plot? Did you see them coming, or were you caught off guard? I was gagged by this twist that Sam was trans. Sam is the child of one of the women who decided to go out on the frontier. Him and his mom are very significant to the plot as well. It was interesting to see how the author handled his gender, when during this time there wasn't a lot of language to describe what Sam was experiencing. Overall, this was a solid horror novel. I read this when I was in Canada, and I'm glad that it was a good book because it helped me cope with being in a foreign country by myself. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. So yeah, thank you for going on this journey with me through my top books of 2024. I will have the link to all of my socials down in the description, and I will see you around. Mwah.